Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL wire site covering the Arizona Cardinals. My co-host is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from SB Nation. And this is episode 343. The Cardinals aren't in the playoffs. I'm going to talk about the playoffs. There is an all-NFC West championship game in the NFC. We had a great weekend of divisional round football. It was sad that the Cardinals weren't there, but let's in this episode, before we jump into the Cardinal stuff, let's talk about this playoff weekend, Seth. Just how fun was this weekend? Aside from not having the Cardinals in the round, how much did you enjoy the weekend of football?
You know, it was a lot of fun, and it showed that, I mean, because, you know, you and I get inundated with ideas and thoughts from fans quite often, and we appreciate them. I want to say that too. That, you know, this is what the Cardinals need to do, and this team proves why. I thought it was interesting that 8 teams, 4 teams left, you know, obviously. Everybody's kind of lamenting that you have to have this type of quarterback, you know, the Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and, well, you and I would agree that it would be lovely to have a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen. Those guys don't grow on trees. In fact, they're very difficult to find. And so I think more than that, it was good to see, you know, a game like Green Bay and San Francisco where there wasn't much offense, and you saw defenses stand up and make plays for struggling quarterbacks or quarterbacks that made mistakes. You saw the same thing in the Tennessee-Cincinnati game. I mean, people are loving Joe Burrow, and rightfully so. He's played well. But, you know, if you go to the actual game, did he really play that well?
He made some nice throws, but that was all about the Cincinnati defense taking the ball away 3 times.
Yeah, and I mean, people look at it and go 348 yards. I mean, he played great, but I mean, he had no touchdowns. He threw an interception, and to your point, yeah, I mean, it comes down to the fact that the Cincinnati defense intercepted Ryan Tannehill 3 times and made, you know, turned the ball over 3 times and gave Burrow a chance at the end because Tennessee was driving. And then you saw the importance of a kicker, you know, all weekend, right? Like all these game-winning field goals and things like that. So it's just, I think it was cool to see the different ways that you can win football games, the different ways that teams can be built and come together. You know, most people are going to take away, well, you know, Mahomes and Burrow are young quarterbacks, and yeah, they are, and that's the thing. But you've got 2 guys that you know were traded for in Matt Stafford and Jimmy Garoppolo. You've got 2 guys that, or 1 guy in Garoppolo who, you know, I would say 90% of the fan base wants gone and replaced by the rookie. And so that's the thing is, I mean, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, and we're seeing it now in these playoffs. And I think that's the best thing that you can see is that while the quarterback is important, unless you're going to get an all-pro type, you need a complete team. And that, I mean, while this doesn't exonerate Cliff and Kyler from their stinker of their first playoff appearance, it also shows how much further this roster for the Arizona Cardinals has to go in order to be in that same competitiveness of the 4 teams remaining.
And my biggest takeaway, what was this? It was for whatever reason, the Cardinals, once they face, and this was kind of their thing all year, we've talked about on the show, I don't know how many times, in the face of adversity, when they fall behind, they didn't seem to have the laser focus. They've come back in games, so they came back against Minnesota, they came back against Green Bay, they came back against Jacksonville. But far too often, when things got sideways early, they just had no way to bounce back, and we saw teams do that. San Francisco was a great case of this. That they, at the end of the game, they kept playing like their focus. They never lost focus.
Well,
and the Cardinals, that's what it felt like. The Cardinals felt like they lost focus after things got sideways, and the same thing with the Bucs. They were down 27-3. And then the Rams kind of, started falling apart for whatever reason, and the Bucs pushed it all the way back to a tie before they made those big throws. And so it was what we saw were mentally strong, focused teams, and perhaps down the stretch that's what the Cardinals lacked. And it might have been in their head, with the losses mounting, that when things got sideways early, it was, oh crap, and they couldn't get it out. They couldn't get out of their own way.
Well, and you look at it, I mean, you brought up the San Francisco game, and I think that's just such an important game because San Francisco didn't score an offensive touchdown, and they won the game. And so your quarterback cannot play well. I mean, think about it. Jimmy Garoppolo threw a interception as they're driving to score their only touchdown, and Jimmy Garoppolo threw an interception on just a terrible pass to George Kittle, and it didn't cost them the game. And to your point, that seems the mental aspect of it for the Cardinals as a team just seems like part of the issue. Like, if Kyler doesn't start off fast, if Cliff doesn't start off fast, if the defense
they don't get a big play early,
right, then it's just, oh, here we go, instead of being able to kind of regroup, refocus, and continue on, like you said. And so, I think that's all just going to come with continued growth, but that's, if you allow this team to continue to grow. And that's, and I get it. It's really difficult to do that when you see what you saw in that playoff loss.
Another thing that came up recently, this is, we heard the rumors of the not meeting of where crap hit the fan, about, maybe changes happening. So the Bidwell, Keim, Kingsbury meeting. So Bidwell, because of the Super Bowl committee, he spoke about the Super Bowl coming to Phoenix next year, to come on to Glendale. And Kent Summers was able to talk to Bidwell. And he said something, internal discussions, but that he comes to, it should bother, if he was bothered or upset by the success, or to see specifically their division rivals making it to the NFC Championship game. And he said, I think any fan would be bothered, especially this one, referring to him. How bothered are you? So, perspective from the Cardinals side, how bothered are you to see the Cardinals get bumped and to see both the Rams and the 49ers in the title game?
I mean, obviously it sucks, but when you look at it from a couple of perspectives, one, the 49ers were in the NFC champion, or in the Super Bowl just 2 seasons ago. And all they've done is, improve, right? You lose Joe Staley and you're like, oh man, that's a tough one. And then you actually somehow get better. Like,
Trent Williams, come on, that's not fair.
And so like, that's the reality of it. And we talked about the Rams, right? Like, most teams, when you lose your starting running back, you go, you go, okay, I'll go pick up a cheap veteran. Instead the Rams go and get Sony Michel. When you lose a guy that's basically your pseudo 1A receiver in Robert Woods, especially that in that part of the season, you're like, can we get a AJ Green type, right? Like a guy that's kind of washed, but may be able to help out a little bit. And they go get Odell Beckham Jr. Like those are alpha moves, and they've already got a good pass rush, and then they go and get Von Miller. Like these are all chess pieces to win a Super Bowl, and that's the difference to me when you look at the two franchises more than anything else. Is like the Cardinals lost J.J. Watt, and they didn't make a move. They said, well, hopefully these guys in here that we got Watt so we didn't have to play them can in fact play well, right? And then you look at like the DeAndre Hopkins loss. You're like, well, hopefully the guys we have in place are more than enough. And so those are the things I think that make it where you've got teams that have built depth but are also really aggressive when they feel like they're close. And I just feel like while the Cardinals might be aggressive in terms of free agency or like off-season moves, they're not very aggressive in terms of in-season moves that they make.
Well, and part of that is just the way they had their cap structured, is that they went all out, all in the off-season, and knew that they weren't going to be able to be super flexible in season.
Well, and I think one of the things that you see, though, is that you can be aggressive, but you also have to be willing to basically say, yeah, we know that this is going to sabotage us for the next, 5 seasons, but we're going for it.
Right. For me, there's a mix of I don't know how bothered I am by it, because, well, one, there is a part of me that, while I am not actively rooting for the Rams, part of me would like to see the Rams win the title, win the Super Bowl overall, because we know what it does. It justifies the loss that the Cardinals have. And if we're going to go all the way back to like we talked about before the season, the Rams team was the loaded one that I said before the season should be the Super Bowl favorites coming out of the NFC, because it's so hard to repeat, like Tampa Bay with the same roster. And this Rams team has always been good, and then they upgraded a quarterback. They just were super inconsistent, but get to the playoffs, they steamroll the Cardinals, they steamroll the Buccaneers for a half. If they win the Super Bowl, there's a little bit of, apart from hating it because they're a division rival, but there's a part of it that feels vindicated about why the Cardinals lost. The San Francisco thing, it only bothers me because you can't control the other side of the bracket, but it only bothers me because we would have been able to play the 49ers at home. That's the one I'm like, we could have hosted an NFC Championship game where, in the Cardinals in the playoffs at State Farm Stadium, they don't lose. And so right. It's just disappointing. So it doesn't bother me to see, especially because we felt all year the NFC West was the best division in football. I've been on the record saying that I thought that all 4 NFC West teams had Super Bowl ceilings, and it was coming to come. Then the Seahawks they had the least fortunate season. And San Francisco got hot down the stretch overall. And, it's good. Like, I'm not one to, as an Arizona State fan, I don't give a dang. I don't give a poop. I don't give a rat's rear about how the Pac-12 does overall. I don't want the Pac-12 to do anything. And I'm kind of like that same way for the NFC West, only it just vindicates, here it does, it just vindicates the fact that this is a freaking good conference. It's a freaking good division. And so maybe I'm not as bothered by it, because if the Rams end up rolling through everyone, you're like, well, that was the Super Bowl champs for me. That's what it is. So it doesn't bother me nearly as much, other than the missed opportunity to be able to have hosted that conference championship game against the 49ers, against a team that they seem to match up really well against.
Yeah, they definitely do, and it's one of those situations, like you said, where it's just unfortunate that they couldn't, that they found the hottest team in the bracket in the first round, and that they were unable to, get things going, and who knows, once you're in it and playing well. But we also know that this is a franchise that is, in terms of LA, that's all in this season, that they are 100%. They have to win a Super Bowl, or this is a failure. And that's kind of like how Tampa Bay was last year and this year, right? Like, this season for Tampa Bay was a complete failure. Now, because of how the Cardinals played early in the season, we said, and JJ Watt came out and said this season was a failure, but there was no expectation. And now that's not to absolve them for how they played at the end of the season. That's not doing that at all. What I'm saying is that when you look at it from that perspective,
they were never considered a Super Bowl team until they went 7-0, when they elevated expectations. But before the season, this was a team that was, hey, they're a playoff contender who could make some noise if everything goes right, and they did, and then they fell apart. They became essentially the team that everyone thought that preseason expectations. They made the playoffs, but that lost to the Rams.
Right. And so, but that's the thing, is we only look at how they lost. We don't actually think about how they got there and everything like that. So, it is what it is. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's pretty simple. I'm cheering for the Chiefs. I mean, there's nothing else to it. I'm going for the Chiefs. I want to see the Chiefs continue to succeed if the Cardinals aren't going to succeed, because I like Mahomes. I like Andy Reid. I mean, it sucked that Andy Reid used Arizona as a prop to go get more money, but at the same time, the Cardinals were able to get a good little run out of Bruce Arians. So when you look at it from that perspective, you can't completely hate Andy Reid.
Not at all. And if when it comes to outside of the Cardinals, for me, it becomes rooting for players that I really like, and they tend to be the quarterbacks. I would have loved to see Tom Brady win another one. I think that type of career we're never going to see again, and I want to keep seeing it go. And just the evolution of Tom Brady, the player Tom Brady, the public persona, he became much more likable at the back end of his career. But Mahomes, my goodness. There's kind of a pro and a con to rooting for each of the teams, or to whether it's rooting for or kind of backwards support. Basically, like the radio station here posed the question, which team are you rooting for in the NFC Championship game? The 49ers or the Rams? I'm like, the AFC. If in the heart of hearts, I just don't want one of them to win the championship, even though part of me would be comforted. I would be comforted by the Rams winning the Super Bowl, because it means, the Cardinals lost to the eventual world champions, and that's, they beat everyone else and won the championship, so I guess that there's that. But definitely, I'm Mahomes first. Joe Burrow would be fun. So Mahomes and the Chiefs, that's what you look to the franchise in terms of with Kyler Murray and all that, how you build a team to do it. You look at the Bengals. Oh, that young quarterback did it. So you kind of see, it's bittersweet, because you're like, oh, they did it. They did what we wanted to do and did it a year faster with Joe Burrow. Then you look at the 49ers, and you're like, Okay, I don't think there's no scenario for where you're rooting for the 49ers.
Right.
And then the Rams, it's more of a case of you hate them because they're the division rivals. But then there's the comfort of having lost to the eventual champs, and then you're like, that justifies their loss in the playoffs. So, yeah, I'm rooting for Mahomes, but basically, please win the Super Bowl AFC so that
so we can be okay with it.
and the part that bothers me about the Rams is like you went all out, like you went all in this year to win a championship, and then to do it kind of like the Bucs last year, but they had Brady, which is different, and to have it pay off, and you're like, no, that's not supposed to happen because
right. You're supposed to build the right way, and,
right? And you're supposed to be heartbroken because you're like, yeah, we're going to go all in, and then you lose, and then you're sad. And we like to see sadness from other teams because, hey, if there's one thing about sports fans, misery loves company. And
right, exactly.
You know what? Being a fan of a team, I don't know why we do it. It's natural to do it, but it's all it is. All it is sadness and rage and disappointment because only one team gets to be happy at the end of the year. Only
right.
one. Only one.
And ours has never been happy. So.
Nope. Never. Never. Because even that, like, they committed Super Bowl, that's so great, but then they were so close to winning. And so then you're like, you hate Santonio Holmes, you hate Aaron Francisco, you hate Ben Roethlisberger, and you hate everything about us. So yeah. All right, coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on. There is the possibility that Vance Joseph will be leaving because he could be the head coach of a team in the NFL. What does that mean for the defensive coordinator position? Who would make a nice fit? That's coming up next on Rise of C-Red. We're back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. It feels like Vance Joseph, defensive coordinator for the Cardinals, it kind of feels like, DraftKings has it going as well, so he's kind of the betting favorite right now to land the head coaching job of the Miami Dolphins, a place where he coached before one season. He was the defensive coordinator there in 2016. And he parlayed that performance into his first head coaching job with the Denver Broncos. And the vibe coming out of everything out of Miami is that he's the favorite to lead the position, which means the Cardinals would need to make a change. They would have to hire a new defensive coordinator. First off, we kind of talked about this before, but do you want Vance to get the job? Like, from a Cardinal standpoint, for Vance, the person, yes, absolutely, get another chance, get to be a head coach with a young quarterback you believe in. But as we're looking ahead specifically to 2022, is Vance Joseph leaving the best thing for the Cardinals?
I go back and forth. I think for one reason it is because I think that they just need a new scheme, not a new voice, a new scheme for the defense. And so for that reason, I say yes. I also say no. And the reason I say no is because I do worry that it's going to be difficult to find a veteran or seasoned coach that's willing to come to an organization with two guys that are lame ducks in Cliff Kingsbury and Steve Keim.
Yeah, that is tough. That's the one thing that's tough. Well, and so are you going to be able to bring a guy in who can build the defense up without having it step back? Let's be honest, the Cardinals kind of struck gold that first year when they went from Todd Bowles to James Bettcher. James Bettcher had not been a coordinator at all. Arians believed in him. And they statistically, they maintained or even improved, even though there were definitely some flaws in Bettcher as a coordinator, as we would find out over the next couple of years. But far too often when you change coordinators, you see a dip in performance. And we saw it, we saw it from the 49ers. We saw it from the Rams, some of the defensive inconsistencies. And so you've got to be able to tread water on the other side of the ball. And so then it becomes the question of how much do you want continuity and how much do you want to change things completely that perhaps is better for the team? The Cardinals in 2014, after 2014, opted for continuity so that James Bettcher was basically building on the Todd Bowles defense. Would you rather see them, and you obviously said different scheme, see a continuation of Vance Joseph's style of defense or a new one for 2022, and a team that, 2022 now becomes that window to show that they're not going to be that they're trending still in the right direction. They can close the season strongly, make the playoffs, be competitive in the playoffs.
Yeah, and that's the thing is I truly do think that they need to move on from Vance. And so whether he gets a job or not, I think they need to move on from him. And it's not that I don't think Vance is a good coach. I actually do. But I feel like he and Cliff both being players coaches, and that's one of the things you're seeing coming out of Miami right now. One of the positives about him is that players love playing for him. And, we've heard from Jordan Hicks and Zach Ertz this offseason how much they enjoyed playing for Cliff. And because Cliff treats them like men, because Cliff, more or less is a player's coach. I think it's hard to have two of those guys as kind of basically, I know they're not, but co-head coaches, because then it seems like it's on the team to come out and, have that kind of fire in your eye. And these guys are professionals, so let's be frank, they should not need motivation to play hard and things of that nature, but they're also humans, and sometimes you do need that voice. And so I think getting a guy in that way, I've mentioned a couple names to you, like a Mike Zimmer, a guy that is schematically, in my opinion, superior to Vance, but he's also kind of a hard ass, right? Like he's kind of an old curmudgeon guy. That might be a fit. That being said, does he want to even coach? That's a fair question.
And like Mike Zimmer it'd be interesting because if you kind of look at the Cardinals roster, you want to look at what's gonna if Vance leaves to be a head coach. Now that benefits the Cardinals because it'll pick them up a couple of draft picks, and it's good for Joseph himself because he will land a head coaching job. Is the team, is Michael Bidwill, is Steve Keim, are they going to insist on maintaining that 3-4 defensive scheme? With Chandler Jones probably on the way out, with your young linebackers and your veteran linebacker and Jordan Hicks on the team, it's almost, and you've talked about this, is this and the way Byron Murphy is a better playmaker, not necessarily lined up man-to-man and press all the time, that perhaps a 4-3 not press man defense might be the better fit for the personnel that they currently have.
Yeah, I think kind of what the Seahawks did would be probably better for them. But, and that goes to a larger discussion that you and I can have on this show at another time. But, the insistence, like you said, on being a quote unquote 34 team, like,
and not just that, but a 3-4 attacking.
Right. Is that just because that's where they had success once, that was where their success was, so that's where they want to stay? Because it doesn't, based on like draft picks, it doesn't always feel like that's where they are. So I think this team's got a lot of opportunities in their hands that we honestly, let's, you and I, be completely frank about this. We didn't see this happening. And it's not a done deal by any means. So it could be Vance coming back and this is all moot. But when you look at it, you and I, we're like, I don't think Vance is getting, like, we were,
especially the way how the defense kind of faded.
Finished.
Right.
Yeah.
You wonder, but here's the thing. Miami makes a fantastic fit, and Joseph is a fantastic fit there because if you look at what they looked for in Brian Flores, just the problem was Brian Flores was unlikable.
Yeah,
so you get the same type of leader, the same type of defensive mind, the same honestly, and the minority aspect does continue to be attractive. Only you get a nicer version of Brian Flores and Vance Joseph, who has had a head coaching experience. And honestly, if you look at his time in Denver, the failures were not... He didn't win enough games, but at the same time, the Broncos have had a mess at their quarterback position. He was trying to win games with Trevor Siemian and Paxton Lynch and to the like. And so he just didn't have a quarterback. If they believe that Tua Tagovailoa is that guy, and you add Vance Joseph's defensive mind and people skills and leadership abilities, someone who's not unnecessarily harsh on players, but is also willing to be frank and honest with them. He's not going to blow smoke up their rear either. He's going to be upfront. But in a kind, and not with the same bravado that Bruce Arians is, where unnecessarily swearing at people, knee deep, all that kind of sort of thing that Bruce Arians did. Vance Joseph is a great fit there, honestly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is a larger discussion too that we can have, but every coaching style works when it works, right?
Exactly.
Like you look at these coaching styles, like Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan are players coaches, right? And then you've got Bruce Arians, the disciplinarian. I mean, Andy Reid's a players and a coach's coach. Like, people love playing for Andy Reid. But then, Bill Belichick's the greatest coach of all time. You mentioned Arians, is kind of a fire-breathing dragon. Like, you can win with different guys. The thing is just that you have to win, and so like when you don't win, whether they're no matter what it is, and we're seeing it with Cliff, not enough discipline, right? Like, that's the big thing. This team's just not disciplined enough. And so typically what happens to NFL franchises, what do? They swing wildly in the other direction, right? So you go from...
They take player freedoms away to say very regimented, very strict, very harsh.
Right. So like a guy you would replace Cliff with would be like a Brian Flores, where think about it, like players and coaches didn't want to work with him. That's baffling, man. Like, and they won 7 games in a row to end the year, and the GM and
they're like,
so like,
nope,
can't do it, man. Like, can't do
nope, it. Don't like him. So there's a couple of ways that they could go. So continuity wise, let me give you a couple of names. Let me give you a couple of names that would maintain kind of the core of the defense. One, promote Billy Davis. He's been a defensive coordinator in multiple places. He was a defensive coordinator for the Cardinals. He is of the same sort of coaching tree and style of defense, running a 3-4, Wade Phillips-ish type. Or they could go get the original version of the Wade Phillips defense and go with Wade Phillips. I really like the idea of Wade Phillips. One, just because of the track record. If he coaches a defense, that defense goes to the playoffs, which is the type of thing they need right now. Billy Davis would maintain that continuity, but I know he would be. Let's be honest.
That would be a largely panned move.
That would the fans would really hate that. Honestly, they would hate it. He's been a defensive coordinator before. Like, here's the thing: he's got the resume to do it. But it would not go well. This would not be well received by fans unless statistically they came out and
unless
were
they
great.
Played well.
If they, but it would be like, oh, I hate this, and then when it doesn't, it would be kind of like. And I think that's a lot of thing with Cliff Kingsbury right now is that all the questions about him coming in and his hiring are still tainting people's thoughts now. Like, It's like he was a horrible pick from the beginning. He's going to playoffs, but he's horrible. He's the worst coach in the world. And that sort of thing. But yeah, Billy Davis does not move the dial for me. Wade Phillips, though, I'd be all about that. I would love that.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at it, if you, like you said, if you want to have continuity, those are the guys, right? You got to bring in somebody that either runs the same type of defense, so somebody from the Wade tree, or you bring in Wade. I've heard a couple of people mention Buckner. He's gotten some looks from colleges.
But that's the position. I know he's trying. I know he wants to move up. The thing is, what makes it interesting about him, what is he schematically? That's the big mystery to me. What is he schematically? Because we know nothing. Because he was not part of the original. He's not part of the original defensive staff. So he's worked for 3-4 teams. Because he was with the Cardinals before, with the Bruce Arians and Todd Bowles and James Bettcher. He was with 4-3 teams in Oakland back before then, and I think it was before he was Las Vegas, and then he comes back to a 3-4. What scheme would he run if he were coordinating his own defense? That becomes very intriguing. That's the unknown. We don't know if he'd be a good quote. He's a great position coach, or he's in terms of what. He's a highly respected position coach.
And I mean, let's be honest, he's got a bunch of suitors, so obviously, he's not just respected by the players. So, but yeah, so I mean, and then who's the defensive backs coach? I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but
there's Robertson, Marcus Robertson, Greg Williams.
Robertson. So you got those guys. If you keep it in-house, like you said, Billy Davis is probably the most likely just because he's done it before. If you go outside, I mean, you've got some options. We talked about Zimmer. He's a 43 guy.
Here's a name.
I don't know if he'd be.
What about Ken Norton? Especially since you were talking about kind of the build it the kind of the Seahawks way. They've got kind of that personnel. What if Ken Norton were that guy?
Yeah, I don't think that would be a bad hire. I mean, I think that would actually be a nice fit. And like I talked about, he's a little bit harder of a coach. He's a little bit. I mean, he's still a player's coach because he was a player, but he's a little bit more demanding of the guys. And I think, when you look at it from that perspective, that might be something this team needs. Another name I threw out in our group chat that is interesting to me, and this is if things are going awry. So maybe you can't get a Mike Zimmer, maybe you can't get a Ken Norton, maybe Wink Martindale ends up, not wanting to come here, or Vic Fangio, the big DC names, we'll say. What about a guy like Jimmy Lake, who coached Budda Baker and Byron Murphy up in Washington as their DB and coach and defensive coordinator, and then was the DC and then a head coach and then got fired recently. Like, yeah, he's a guy that you might be able to bring in, and maybe he's the type of guy that can rally the troops, so to speak, if you're not staying in house. And what I mean by that is if guys don't want to hitch their wagon to Cliff, and let's be honest, that would be understandable just from the sense of that he is on the hot seat publicly at this point. I think we would all agree. A guy like Lake, it would just be a foot in the door type of thing for him, and like he's coached in the NFL, he's coached at the highest level in college, obviously, and now he gets a chance to run his own defense. I mean, like I said, I think that's a break in case of emergency type thing, but I'd almost rather take a swing like that than just go to Billy Davis too.
Here's a name. I know he's retired. Chuck Pagano was a name that was highly connected to the Cardinals, and I believe he was perhaps the first choice over Vance Joseph to be the defensive coordinator. Because here's the thing with what it appears this coaching staff is facing this year, it doesn't feel like if Vance Joseph were to get hired, that they would want someone who hasn't. They would want a name I think they would want someone with more experience and name recognition because of the scenario they're in with the coaching staff. What if? Do you think that Pagano would be willing to and that he would be a good fit for the Cardinals in this situation, because it does feel like we're now facing a hot seat year?
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, a Pagano or, like you brought up earlier, Wade Phillips, and I know that this is not something you want to hire a defensive coordinator for. So I want to put that as the biggest, blinking caveat. However, if you hire a Pagano or a Wade Phillips and you get off to a slow start, 1-4, 0-5 for whatever reason, those are guys that have been head coaches in the league too, right? And they'll command the respect of the team if they were to move on from Cliff in season.
And who could, because they've done it before, potentially could lead a rally towards the end of the year.
Right, exactly. And so those are, I think those are the guys that they need to go after. I think, honestly, for me, Zimmer's the top guy I would go after. And I know people don't like him, but from a defensive scheme standpoint, until the last year, he did a really nice job in Minnesota, right?
Yeah. Although I do think if there's a place he's going to land, I think after Dan Quinn gets hired somewhere, that his fit is going to be back in Dallas where he coached years ago.
Right. And that's probably accurate with that, if he wants to coach even. But to your point, those are the type of guys I would go after. I wouldn't want to bring in.
So you want another defensive head, head coach type of scenario, like a Vance Joseph. And I think that's what they would want to do still.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's still the best thing. And one of the things that I don't think Cliff gets enough credit for, and quite frankly, is refreshing for people like you and I know it drives fans crazy, but Cliff is a guy that is very humble, and he's very willing to take on the criticisms, and he's also very willing to listen and take suggestions from others. And I just feel like that gets overlooked a lot of times because people just have fun, clowning on him because of his end of the season failures, and rightfully so. You can't ignore those things. But when you look at it, Cliff never throws his players under the bus.
Never, literally never. You will not hear that. The AJ Green thing against Green Bay was as close as I've ever heard him to even place any sort of blame on any player.
And what did he say? There was some miscommunication.
Yeah, it was that was the look we wanted, but obviously we got to do a better job of communicating. That way it's crystal clear.
And so, and that's the thing. We talk about it a little bit, but that's why Jordan Hicks basically unsolicited gave his, I love playing for Cliff, because he's a guy that he protects his players, right? He's on his players' side. And he's the same way with his coaches. I'm sure there's times he wanted to go out and be I didn't agree with what Kugler was doing blocking. I didn't agree with what Vance was doing on defense. I'm sure there's times like that. And I'm sure there's times where he's had those conversations with them privately, but we never hear about it. And that's the thing. So I don't think Cliff has an ego where he's going to, not allow a guy to come in and be helpful and listen. And I think he's willing to learn from a Zimmer or a Pagano or a Phillips, just still continue to grow as a coach.
Coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best our Cardinals talk about, we're going to broach very lightly, a little bit, on a weird report, I'm going to call air quotes report, about something that came out the Cardinals on Tuesday. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best our Cardinals talk on the web. And some weird report came out Tuesday. We know, we've heard it. We know that Michael Bidwill is unhappy with how things ended. And understandably so. The coaching staff, Cliff's got to be unhappy. The players should be unhappy. Keim should be unhappy. Everyone should be unhappy. But the report, I'm not going to call it a report, but it was a suggestion. It was the statements of two presumed facts. One, by Jason La Canfora, who is not, let's remind, he is not a legit NFL reporter. He's a reporter, opinionist, but to consider him a like real NFL reporter these days is, I think it's a stretch. So he comes out and tweets this. One, Michael Bidwill is upset with how things ended the season. Okay, we know that. We've heard that from several people. And two, I'm hearing that coaches have not been paid their playoff bonuses. Framing it in such a way, one, Bidwill is upset. Therefore, they did not get their playoff bonuses, which set Cardinals Twitter kind of on fire. They're like, "Oh, it's poverty franchise. We're a dumpster fire. We're a trash. Like we're awful. Greedy Bidwill. Blah blah blah." Then Pro Football Talk, did some actual reporting. Actually contacted the team and said, we were just eliminated 8 days ago. One, two, they're being processed. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because there's the notion that, do you really think I would like to think, and this is just based on logic and common sense in my mind. Okay. Someone obviously probably thought that they should have been paid their playoff bonuses. And I know that money comes differently than their regular game checks, and it's bonuses and things like that. So the amount might vary from this or that. But one, how many times, I'm going to pose this to all you listeners out there. How many times have you, think about where your wages are set. Do you get paid immediately for things or is it hit a pay period after that? So, and that's my thing, is okay, if we're going to make it sound like the Cardinals are withholding money because they're upset with the finish, frame it that way. You need to say the Cardinals are withholding playoff bonuses, which now becomes which makes no sense at all, because that would ruin them as a franchise. That would ruin everything about their reputation league wide if Bidwill did do that. Did he say, maybe he said something in the notion, but my guess is someone is unhappy with how things have been handled since the end of the season, leaked word of that, we didn't get it paid yet. Even though they probably wouldn't have gotten paid. When I get paid for my football work, they invoice it, and it takes anyway between a week, 9 to 15 days for that invoicing. And I'm sure that's what because this is not a regular payroll thing. You have to, contract, invoice, payroll, blah, blah, blah. That's not an instantaneous thing. That takes several days. So what was your takeaway of this? Because I don't get upset at many things. I was very upset with the way that La Canfora framed it, because it seems so utterly outrageous that an NFL team would be, or an owner would be petty enough to just say, I'm withholding this money, when we know that money is contractually linked. And if he were to do that, there would be zero. There's zero winning for him in there, other than he's sending a message, but that would lead to legal trouble. That would lead to league problems. It just seems absurd to me.
Yeah, and it would be one of those situations where, like you said, if that was the actual case, one, that's going to become public because there's going to be lawsuits, right? And then you talk about a poverty franchise. Whether or not we agree with everything that Michael Bidwill does, one of the things
he has elevated the reputation of this franchise.
Well, not just that, but you wouldn't want to go. And I don't even think Bill did anything like that. That's just that's stuff that.
That's honestly, next level petty.
Yeah, that's stuff that just doesn't happen. So I'm not surprised that it's a La Canfora report. He's a silly guy. So that being said, I think this is just a situation where either a coach that's new and down the ladder doesn't know when those paychecks come in, or there was a misrepresentation of what actually happened.
Yeah, and who knows? Yeah, who knows what happened? So that's all I want to talk about because I think it's nonsense. And if it's real, well, then we've got some major problems with this franchise. Then if that is a real thing that the individual was withholding money that they are rightfully due. Okay, then we've got have another discussion about and that'll lend credence to some of the nonsense we hear about this franchise from some other local radio people. So let's not talk about that. Coming next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. We are going to look back at the roster, and we're going to talk about position groups and not necessarily grade, but we're going to evaluate the different position groups. We're coming back. We're going to start on the offense side of the ball. That's coming next on Rise of C-Red. We're back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. We've got all this off-season stuff, but before we move forward to the off-season, who should stay, who should go, positional needs, let's look kind of and grade/evaluate the different position groups, and rather than a letter grade, which we're just throwing a letter. So I want to go like this. Did the position group, were they great? Were they good? Were they adequate? Or were they subpar? Let's start with the quarterback position. If you had to look at the totality of the season, what would you grade? How would you evaluate the quarterback position? So Kyler, almost all this season, and then a little bit of Colt McCoy when he came in.
I would say good. I mean, there was obviously the end of the season that we wish was better. That being said, I mean, the overall outcome of the season and the play was good.
Yeah, and I think that if we're going to say it's good bordering on great, it started great and it tailed off. And so
to average. And so,
yes,
yeah.
I think they were good to great, but the totality was they were good, but they weren't good enough. So, yeah, that's fair. Running back, would you say they were great, good, adequate, or subpar?
I would say they were adequate, bordering on good. And the reason that I would say adequate, bordering on good more than anything is that because they were injured. They missed 7 games combined, and they were nicked up in a number of other games.
And I mean, I'm going to call their running back group good. I think it would have been great if we had the Chase Edmonds, James Conner duo for the entire season. Well, but the last half of the year, you basically got one or the other. But what we saw this year, which was much better than in 2020, is that the running game was able to thrive without the production from Kyler Murray. And so for me, the running back group was good. They weren't great. They had great moments, and I think they were better than adequate personally.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I just think the health for me prevented them from being good, because like more than good. And that was the thing, is if they would have been healthy for most of the year, they probably would have been good to great. But I think just the overall health of the situation, that's where I struggled with doing more than average, leaning towards good.
What would you say about the receiving core?
Man, I would say that's average, leaning towards bad. I think at the beginning of the year it was good, leaning towards great, and then after the injury to D-Hop, it basically became adequate, and by the end of the season it was bad. And so that fall off is one of the issues we've talked about, is that if they don't have an alpha out there dictating the coverages and allowing other guys to have single coverage, they're just not a good receiving corp. And that's troubling to me.
If I were to look at the whole season, they were on the low end of good. AJ Green, I mean, let's be honest, if we look at his overall, he was wildly inconsistent, but if you look at the end of the year production, you're saying we would have, when you take 50-plus catches and over 800 yards, yeah, sign us up for that. Christian Kirk nearly cracked 1,000. Sign me up for that. The problem was DeAndre Hopkins was lost for most of the year, and so they went from being good to great to the low end of good, and basically the season was more adequate to me. They were adequate at best, because then the passing offense mostly was the result of James Conner and Zach Ertz. So, yeah, low end of good, creeping down into adequate, but there were reasons for that. It would have been nice to get more consistent play from Kirk and Green after Hopkins' injury, but I don't want to take away from the overall season that Kirk had. He had a solid season, and Green had a bounce-back season, most certainly. It showed that he still has something in the tank, even if the legs necessarily are there still.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what they do, because both those guys are free agents now.
Yeah, that's one of the major things is we'll be getting into in the shows to come. Tight end. So that started out with Max Williams playing at a high level for him. Then it went to where you got Darrell Daniels. Then they go get Zach. Well, I guess if there wasn't, so it was basically from Max Williams to Zach Ertz with some play with Darrell Daniels and Demetrius Harris. And, the Darrell Daniels, who, of course, naturally in a playoff game should be a central piece of the offense.
For the first time all season.
Yeah. So, how would you grade the tight ends overall?
I think they were good, because I think Max and Zach brought them there. I think that that's a good group, man. Like, at the end of the day, I think that if you can get those two back, you're in a good spot.
Yeah, it would be fantastic to get those back. I have them, like, the position overall, that's at the low end of good. I think Max, that was really unfortunate because he was having such a good year. But had he not gotten hurt, then we would have gotten Ertz, and I think Ertz was critical down the stretch.
And, man, if you can bring both of them back at reasonable, if you can bring them back for like 11 or 12 combined, like eight and 4 or something,
that's beautiful.
That would be ideal.
That would be fantastic, and it would make the Cardinals it would give Cliff Kingsbury so much flexibility, Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Offensive line, that's the other thing. So offensive line, what would you give them overall this year?
I would go bad, leaning towards average. Injuries really derailed this whole group. I think they got 2 starts all season with their projected starting 5, and you had ups and downs at every position. So all of those things factored in. I think they were bad overall, because they ended up, after the hot start, they ended up really just falling off at all positions. And I think the only guy that really produced what I would say a consistent year from start to finish was Justin Pugh.
Yeah, you can say that. I don't considering the overall success the Cardinals had and the highs down to the lows, I would still give this offensive line adequate grades. They were adequate this year. When you wanted them to be good to great, because they were good last year. They were good in 2020. This year, they dipped back, and that was a lot because of the injury bug. So I would say overall that they were adequate because they did a good enough job in most of the games. There were, the Rams game was an abomination. It's interesting. So the drop off of the play of Josh Jones for whatever reason. Max Garcia started out great, then he kind of dipped down the stretch, but he had some physical issues going on. Missing Rodney Hudson, he gamed with Sean Harlow there. I would still say that group was adequate overall because we've seen some other teams. It definitely could be worse. They definitely weren't good this year, even though they started that way. But I don't think that they were overall subpar. There were subpar stretches to the season, especially at the end, but I think the overall play was adequate.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Coming up next on the Rise of Sea Red podcast, the best hour Cardinals talk on the way. We will be back and we'll finish up talking about position groups on defense and on special teams. That's coming up next on Rise of Sea Red. We're back on the Rise of Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We move to the defensive side of the ball, and we're going to look at the defensive interior, we'll look at the edge, we'll look at the linebackers, corners, safeties, and then we will look at the overall special teams. The defensive interior, that's a tough one for me. They definitely was, especially, you had disappointment from Jordan Phillips for the amount of time he missed. You got very disruptive play from J.J. Watt, but then he was lost for half the season. You got improved play from Zach Allen, making it look like he is the player that they wanted him to be and still has some direction to go. Lecky Fotu wasn't bad, but he didn't progress, and I think Rashard Lawrence didn't move forward. So I'm going to say that defensive front overall was adequate. And I think I'm going to find that I'm probably not going to give subpar to really any group completely, considering, because the Cardinals had, the season, they had a good season, and they were, even down the stretch while they were bad, like you look at the totality, they were at least adequate. So I'm going to say that defensive interior was adequate, but needed it to be good to great.
Yeah, and I think adequate's fair if you factor in Watt. After Watt, I think that they were bad. And that's where it was felt the most was along that defensive line where all of a sudden they couldn't get pressure and then they struggled, to stop the run. So that's how I would look at it. With Watt, they were adequate. And like you said, you got to factor in when he was in there, because when he was in there, they were actually good.
Yeah. But you go to the edge now. So you've got the combination of Chandler Jones, Marcus Golden, throwing to Devon Kennard, a little bit of Dennis Gardeck, and a mix of Isaiah Simmons for part of this season. And then at the very end, Zaven Collins. The edge presence, which we needed them to be great, that was kind of what they were banking on this year, was a great pass rush duo of Chandler Jones and Marcus Golden, then again J.J. Watt in the interior. And to me, they were on... I think it would be a disservice when you look at the overall production to say that they were only adequate when you have two double-digit sack guys. They were on the lower end of good, but they needed to be great.
Well, and I think the way you can look at it too is that they had great games, but they were overall adequate because they also had they never were that. I think that was the biggest thing. They were never good. They were or even adequate. They were either they were very boom or bust this year.
Yeah.
They were either a crazy game with, one or two sacks and a bunch of tackles for loss, or they were basically not visible. And that was the weirdest thing. And there were weeks where one of them would be super productive and the other one would be invisible. And then there were weeks where both of them were productive. And so, I think adequate's fair because, like you said, their production was good. But I think that their consistency was really bad. And that to me was the biggest thing, is that there was too many ebbs and flows for this team. And like you said, they needed them to be great. And that means when you're off, you're still an average player. And when you're not off, you're still a good player. Or when you're not on all the way, you're still a good player. But that was the thing. It's almost like they skipped those two. They were either the best players on the defense or they were invisible. And that was the weirdest thing to me about them. Because early in the year, after the 5-sack game, even Chandler disappeared
Several games. Now, there were games where he was, like, he didn't get sacks. There were games where he looked very active and disruptive, but didn't have the production. But there were games where you're like, where was he?
Yeah, you're like, is he playing today? Like, and so that's the thing is like, that was a hard one, man. Like, that one really was difficult because, like you said, their production was good, but it's just the consistency of that production that made it difficult.
And when you look at the inside linebackers, this is an interesting group because production-wise, Jordan Hicks played well. Isaiah Simmons' stat line looked good. But then you've got Zaven Collins in his playing time, Tanner Vallejo, Joe Walker. I want to say that this group was adequate, and I'm going to stick with they were adequate, but athletically, I think they were counting on this group to be good. So they underperformed, so they were subpar comparatively to the expectation. But I think that as a linebacker core, that inside group was adequate, and it's mainly because Hicks played much better than we expected him to play, and Simmons, even with some deficiencies this year, still had a pretty dang good year.
Yeah, he took the step that you were expecting, and I think adequate's fair. And part of the reason I think they were only adequate was because the defensive line play in front of them without Watt was bad. And so, that goes back to what we talked about. Like, more than any position, you need those off-ball linebackers really need a lot in front of them, and they just didn't get it this year. And so I think, for that reason, you saw what you saw. Is that part on the linebackers? Yeah, of course. I mean, Jordan Hicks' numbers are inflated because where he's making tackles. Isaiah Simmons' numbers are inflated because of where he's making tackles. But at the same time, they're making tackles. And like we said, the biggest thing was the growth that we saw from Isaiah this year, because that's going to be important moving forward no matter who the defensive coordinator is.
Absolutely. As we move to the cornerback position, this one's a really hard one because everything is so tainted by the end of the season when you had both Marco Wilson hurt and Robert Alford out, which means Byron Murphy played a lot of the season kind of out of position where he had to be the alpha, when really he's their most talented corner. If you make it a situation, because Robert Alford was more than adequate, he was quietly good.
Alford flat out played great this year.
He was so very consistent. Marco Wilson wasn't. I'm not going to say he played badly, because for most of the season three-quarters of the season he played mistake-free.
Yeah, and I thought he was adequate, and for me, a fourth-round rookie, that's good.
Yeah, and Byron at the beginning of the year was so great, but his fallout towards the end of the season, it was noticeable. So I'm on the whole season, they got adequate cornerback play, in my opinion.
I think that's fair.
But collectively, again, that is a disappointment from what they were expecting. They wanted good cornerback play, and ultimately, adequate for what we were expecting, because if the front seven had played that's what we expect this year. We expected the front seven to be great, right? Which would mean adequate back end play would have been fine. And so adequate cornerback play would have been fine, and we got adequate, and that's factoring in the struggles down the stretch. They had good cornerback play for a large chunk of the season. The bad play is what dropped it to adequate. But let's not forget that this was a good cornerback unit for much of the season.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's the thing, is you're going to go to the end of the season and look how bad Murph played and Kevin Peterson and Breon Borders and those guys, and go, ugh. But the reality was, before that, it was a good it was a good group, and so I think when you look at it from that perspective, you have to say it's adequate.
And the safety group, I hope that you agree on me of this. This is the one position group that was great, consistent all year. Buda Baker was great. Jalen Thompson
took huge steps.
Oh my goodness! After missing all that 2020, so we've heard Vance Joseph talk about how good Jalen Thompson, how much he really, and he became that. Not only did he become the back end, the eraser in the back end to stop huge plays, but keeping big plays from being back-breaking plays, which he's been good at since he became an enforcer. You might say that you have one of the best safety duos in the league. It's not going to get the hype that Buffalo's with Poyer and Hyde, but they're right there.
Yeah, it will if you're playing deep in the playoffs, and I think they are one of the, probably one of the top 3, if not 5, safety duos in the league. And this is a great group, and I said it, and I know it's a negative when it comes out this way, but it is something to think about. Like, it is, when you look at it, those are the best 2 pieces they have on defense to sell a defensive coordinator. And so that's not a bad thing when you talk about.
No, especially because what that means is you erase back-breaking plays even when you're giving up big plays.
Right. And so if those 2 are in the back end, you're in a good spot.
And lastly, the special teams unit, the return game was subpar, to say the least. But if I'm going to overall, because they had good coverage, they had good punting, they had good kicking, and the punting and kicking could have been great. But because of Matt Prater goes from God to awful just by changing one of the battery.
Yeah, it's actually a kind of fun.
It's so weird. So overall, that's a good unit with subpar parts.
Yeah, I would agree, and I thought they were good this year, and they played well, and they would have been great if they had stayed healthy the whole season, but they didn't. And you can only go with what you have in front of you.
Absolutely. And with that wraps up this edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, episode 343. Probably we will have a show next week. We're now going to start. We need to look ahead to the off-season schedule, kind of what we're moving forward, because we're going to start. We're going to hit February, which is, the Super Bowl stuff. So we need to talk about team needs and then free agency. So we will tentatively schedule a show for next week, but we might bump it 2 weeks. So we'll start with that. So on behalf of the Rise of C-Red podcast, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening always. We'll probably be back with a new show next week. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise Up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up C-Red.